Okay, today's topic is Hafrashas Challah. And what is Hafrashas Challah? It's an introduction. When you bake something that's bread-like, that means bread, cookies, pizza, all kinds of things that are like that, and it's made from one of the 5 primary grains, that is wheat, spelt, rye, barley, or oats, and the dough is owned by somebody Jewish, then you have to take off a piece of it, and that piece that we separate, we call that challah. Okay, now nowadays, the dough and kohanim are all tamei, so in theory, the challah should go to a kohen and he should eat it, but since the kohen and the challah are both tamei, therefore we burn it or we destroy it once we made the separation. Excuse me. Okay. Now, I mentioned a whole bunch of things like that are bread-like, like bread and cookies and pizza. Those are all made from thicker doughs, heavier doughs. We call those a Belilah Raccah. There's also a mitzvah to do Hafrashas Challah for Belilah Raccah. That is to say, like a pourable batter, like what you'd use to make a sheet cake or pancakes. Now, at home, most people have never seen Hafrashas Challah for a Belilah Raccah. Excuse me, because there's so little flour in the mixture that there's never a Shiur Challah. We're going to talk about Shiur Challah in a second. That there's not a Shiur Challah in it, so they never saw it at home. But in a bakery, something that's more commercial, then is very possible that the amount of flour in there, the cake or the batter that they're making is going to be large enough. There's going to be a Shiur Challah, and the different they are chayv challah, they are chayv hafrashas challah. But the big difference being that when you do a regular hafrashas challah for a regular batter, what we call a Belilah Raccah, then you do the hafrashah from as soon as you mix the flour and water together. From then on is the time that you can do separate challah. While for Belilah Raccah, when like making a sheet cake, then you can only do a hafrashah after they've been baked. Okay, so anyhow, so like I just said, the mitzvah starts when you mix the flour and water together for a typical batter. But and that's the decision point to decide whether it's chayv and challah, which is to say is at that point when the flour and water got mixed together, was it owned by somebody Jewish or was it not? So if a Jewish person owns it and it has a Shiur Challah, it has enough flour in it to be chayv in the mitzvah, then yes, then it's chayv. If it's somebody belongs to someone not Jewish at that time, you're not chayv. Even if a Jew buys it later on, you're not chayv and challah. What happens if it's a shutfis, like partial ownership, let's say in a company, it's a different ownerships, then the din is if the amount of the Jew's ownership would be enough to be chayv and challah, then you're chayv and challah. So for example, a bakery makes a dough out of 50 pounds of flour, and the Jewish person has a 20% ownership. So that means is of this dough, 20% or 10 pounds of the dough are owned by a Jewish person. Well, 10 pounds is definitely a Shiur Challah, and therefore this dough requires Hafrashas Challah. If the Jew had a smaller shear, or the dough was smaller to the point that there was not a Shiur Challah, then there would not be a chiv Hafrashas Challah. Okay, what is the Shiur Challah? I mentioned a few times. There's a Shiur Challah. It means there's a minimum amount that if you need to have that much flour in the mixture in order to be chayv and challah. So the Shiur Challah is actually a volumetric shear. It's a certain amount of size. It's not an amount of weight. It's much more convenient, but for people to work in weight. And I'm going to mention what the shear is in weight. But before I mention, I have to say is that being as a shear is volumetric, it's really not by weight. The shear in weight depends on the type of flour you're using. Meaning not every flour takes up the same amount of space. There's actually quite a dramatic difference sometimes between one and the other, as I'm going to say in a second. And one more thing to mention is that there's different opinions as to how to translate the shiurim into our modern measures. And so what we do is we do hafrashah without a bracha. If you meet a smaller shear, and we don't make a bracha because of a question of whether you need a bracha or not, you don't make the bracha on Hafrashas Challah until there's a larger shear. So I'm going to mention a number of flours and tell you each one of the shear with or without a bracha. So the most common one that people use, just plain white flour made from wheat. So we make a hafrashah without a bracha for 2.5 pounds and a hafrashah with a bracha for 4.7 pounds. Okay, and whole wheat flour has a shiloh, not for today, but has a shiloh. I'm going to assume that a whole wheat flour is just a drop less of 2.3 pounds without a bracha, or 4.4 pounds with a bracha. But then, as we move into spelt flour is just about the same. just about the same as it's like about the same as whole wheat flour, 2.4 pounds and 4.7 pounds. But if we move to rye flour, you make hafrashah without a bracha at 2 pounds and with a bracha at 3.8 pounds. And then when we move to oat flour we make a hafrashah without a bracha at 1.8 pounds, hafrashah with a bracha at 3.5 pounds. Or oatmeal, which is a little fluffier, we make hafrashah without a bracha at 1.6 pounds, and hafrashah with a bracha at 3.1 pounds. So you can see it's quite a dramatic difference. I mean, it's a nice amount more. In regular flour, we make a hafrashah without a bracha at 2.5 pounds, and an oatmeal at 1.6 pounds. So quite a difference between the shiurim. I mean, the shiur is of course the same for each of them. In volume, it's really the same shiur, but in weight, it comes out a different amount depending on which flour you use. Now, two things that are not really we're not going to talk about today is that two opposite things that we're not going to talk about, and they are, and sometimes we could have two batches of dough that were made, and each one of them does not have a shiur challah, but they can somehow be combined together to have a shiur challah, and that's called tzir of sal. They can be combined even after baking in a way that makes them be chayiv and challah. That's called tzir of sal. And the other one is the opposite of that, and that is that sometimes there is a shiur challah in the dough, but the finished product is going to be baked in different places in ways that and each one of those places will have less than a shiur challah. That in those cases, there are times when that means that you're not chayiv and challah, even though when you made the dough originally did have a shiur challah. That's called the isa asuri l'chalik. Again, that's another thing we're not going to talk about, another complicated topic, not for today. Okay, now most of what we're going to talk about today is the following, which is how is Hafrashas Challah done commercially? At home, it's pretty straightforward. The person makes a dough, assuming they had a shiur challah, they're Jewish, they made a shiur challah, and they separate the piece out and then take care of it. But commercially, there are four ways that I'm aware of how Hafrashas Challah is done. The first two tend to be used in retail bakeries, like in your local bakery in your neighborhood, and the latter two tend to be more used in like commercial operations in big commercial bakeries. Okay, so the first one is the simplest. It's the traditional way. You make sure that there's a Shomer Shabbos person at the baking when they need the dough, and that person is Hafrashas Challah. So again, think about your local bakery. Either the owner is there or someone there who's Shomer Shabbos working there, and he's always there when they need the dough, and every time they make the dough, he takes off a piece and he's Hafrashas Challah in the good old-fashioned traditional way. That's the most simple and the most straightforward, if it's possible, if it works. Okay, the second is what we call a dough ball, and that is there's no Shomer Shabbos person going to be there when they're kneading. Think about it. Most bakeries are making their doughs in the middle of the night, so there's no person who's Shomer Shabbos there during the night. But what they do is the people who are there during the night, they take a little piece of dough from each time they make a batter. They take out a little piece and make a little ball of dough, and they put it into the corner. They put it someplace. And then in the morning, when the Shomer Shabbos person shows up, and he sees, last night they made 8 batches of dough, and I see my 8 little dough balls over here. And then what he does is he's Hafrashas Challah from those 8 balls. Most people assume is, what most people practice is that they don't take that whole ball of dough as the challah. They take a piece from the dough ball, from each of the dough balls, and make that the Hafrashas Challah, one piece for each of the doughs that was made. It's not clear if that's really required, but that's assumed they have to do that to fulfill the requirement of Shiur and Nikarim. Not clear if that's really true, but that's what most people assume. So they take of the 8, when there'll be 8 pieces there, from each piece they'll take off half of the piece and say, this is the challah, and the other part is not the challah. Excuse me. Excuse me. There is a little bit of question about whether you should really trust people like that. I mean, think about it. The people during the night who are taking off the dough are not Shomer Shabbos. It's not clear, but people who do this are assuming that they can trust them, that the pieces they take off, they match up, they say, well, we know you made 8 batches, and we know we see 8 batches, and then they trust them. Okay, now the third one is people make Tevel. Tevel means to say is a dough that no one was Hafrashas Challah from, and they make the dough that's chayiv and challah, means for sure it has the amount that's chayiv and challah, and then but they are not Hafrashas Challah. And then what they do is they either take this dough and they freeze it as is, or they bake it into something like a matzah. And again, both of these things they do not do Hafrashas Challah, and then they leave them in the bakery where the baking is going to be done in the future. And what they do is every day the mashgiach takes says that part of the batter or part of the dough or part of the matzah, that's there in the bakery is going to be hafrashah for the things that were made in the bakery. Okay, usually he does this remotely, meaning that the mashgiach does not show up to do this live. He does this. He sits in his house and he says, for that bakery, and we're going to talk about the details. And he actually doesn't even really know how many things they made that day. So he says, well, whatever they're going to make today, I want hafrashah to happen a little bit for each one of them. We're going to talk a little more about this in the future, in a minute. So this is a third way they do it. They use Tevel. So they leave Tevel in the bakery, and the Tevel there's enough Tevel in there that they can keep making little hafrashahs from that Tevel day after day until they use it up. And the last is there are some places where they avoid Hafrashas Challah by selling the flour to someone who's not Jewish before the kneading. I said beforehand that if a non-Jewish person owns it at the time when you mix the flour and water, there's no chiyuv of Hafrashas Challah. So what they do is they sell the flour to someone who's not Jewish, and then they're never chayv challah. They're not doing anything about Hafrashas Challah. So the first three were ways of performing Hafrashas Challah, and this fourth way is a way of saying, well, we're not going to perform Hafrashas Challah, we're just going to do things to avoid the chiyuv of Hafrashas Challah. Okay, so now let's talk some more detail about this Tevel system. I'm going to talk about three different types of topics. So the first is time-related issues. Okay, and the first thing I'm going to say about time-related things is that I'm going to mention the most significant issue with Tevel matzah. Okay, it's somewhat of an issue for Tevel dough, but it's even much more significant for Tevel matzah, and that is that when a person is hafrashas challah, they need to be hafrashas challah from take the challah from dough that grew in the same year, Jewish calendar year as what they're doing the hafrashah on. So for a couple of months of the year, a month or two, usually towards the end of the summer and the early fall, the factories are already, the bakeries and the factories are using flour that already grew in the current Jewish year, but the Tevel matzah was made from the previous year. In other words, let's say in September, the flour, this flour was grown during this Jewish year. Right now it's Tafshin Ayin Beis, is it? Pei Beis, Tafshin Pei Beis. So they'll be using flour that grew during Tafshin Pei Beis. It was planted in this winter or the spring, and it grew in Tafshin Pei Beis. But the matzah that they're using is from Tafshin Pei Aleph. The matzah, the Tevel matzah that they have was made in the previous year. It takes a long time until the Tevel matzah made in Tafshin Pei Beis actually makes it to the bakery. So during that, there's a whole long amount of time when the Tevel matzah and the Tevel and the things that are being baked in the bakery are not from the same years. Now, there are things to do to make that period of time as short as possible, maybe just down to maybe even a couple of weeks. But it's basically it's impossible to avoid this problem. There will always be weeks that the Tevel and the food that you're baking are not from flour of the same year. Ravelsky had a reason to maybe ignore this problem in Chutz La'aretz, but the Eved, most Poskim were not very happy about that. Now, as I mentioned, this is more of an issue for Tevel matzah than for Tevel dough, and the reason is because for Tevel dough, the Tevel dough is made in the actual bakery itself. The bakery, they make a batter, and they say, okay, this is what we're putting aside, as we're going to use this as Tevel, we won't do hafrashah on this. Well, that means the mashgiach can know when the new flour comes in from the year. It's something that the bakeries know when they're starting to get flour from the new year, and the new spring wheat or the new winter wheat, and he can then make a new batch. He can create a new batch of Tevel when the time comes, rather than just keep using the old stuff. But with Tevel matzah, his hands are tied because he can't do anything until he gets new Tevel matzah from the one bakery in the country that makes it. So that's an issue with time-related things. Okay, another thing is that every day the mashgiach, as I had mentioned, is going to say a certain nusach. He's going to say a text every day that says that he wants to make, every time a new batter is created, I want to make a hafrashah. Okay, so I'm going to read you a sample of the kind of text that he would say. And it goes like this. It would say, 30 minutes after every batter of dough is needed in bakery X, here's his name, bakery, a gram of Tevel dough located next to the previously designated piece should be designated as challah for that new batter. In the case of a Belilah Raccah batter, the hafrashah should take place 30 minutes after baking instead of 30 minutes after kneading. This system of continued hafrashah should remain in effect until I verbally cancel it or recite a new system of continual hafrashah. Okay, so that's the kind of a nusach that the person would say. That's not what you say the first day. When you set up when you set up this tevel, you say something a little longer, the first designation. But once the first one is there, and you did the first hafrashah, every day you say something like what I just mentioned a second ago. So the first thing is like this. What happens, I'm saying that every morning I say, I want this hafrashah to work for every batter that's made between now until the next time I say this. Well, what happens if flour arrives after I made this declaration and before I said it again? So I said, let's say the person said the declaration on Friday, and then he doesn't say it again until Monday, but on Friday afternoon, more flour comes in and they bake with it on Shabbos. Okay, so seemingly, he's doing hafrashah on the davar shalai bal olam, and it may not be effective to do the hafrashah. The second thing is that if in the case that I just said to you, he does it on Friday and doesn't say it again until Monday, then he's effectively set up Hafrashas Challah to happen on Shabbos. You're not allowed to do Hafrashas Challah on Shabbos. It's a question whether you're allowed to do it like this, where it happens automatically, but he's setting himself up for that kind of an issue. Okay, so in truth, both of those things that I just mentioned could be avoided if we would switch around the nusach. And you would be saying, instead of saying, I want to make a hafrashah for every batch of dough that will be made, I say I'm making a hafrashah for every batch of dough that was already made, which actually in a Hashgachah you're actually allowed to do. That's okay to do that. As long as they weren't all eaten yet, you're allowed to do that. If he would do that, then he would have solved both of these problems, but then he just have to make sure he does it before the whole batch gets eaten, which is probably not such a big deal. Okay, now, the next group of issues has to do with remote hafrashah, okay? And that is, as I mentioned, this Tevel system is commonly means that the Mashiach does not show up at the factory, either because he's, hundreds of miles away, or he sees no reason to come to the factory. Okay? So one issue is, if you do it remotely, is that the Tevel, if you make Tevel matzah, they make it out of flour, wheat flour. That's the common thing you make it from. But if the bakery is using rye or spelt or one of the other grains, then you need to have tevel made of that grain also. So if you use tevel dough, then the mashgiach can make the dough whatever he wants to. If he knows that this bakery uses rye flour, then he'll tell them to make tevel dough out of rye, and he'll be doing a hafrashah like that. But if he's only doing matzah, the matzah only comes in wheat. It doesn't come in rye or spelt or oats or things like that. And again, since he's doing this remotely, he's not able to just pull out the piece, take a glob of dough out of whatever they're making. If you take a piece of dough, then whatever it is, that's what he made. That's what it is. But if he's doing it remotely, he's got to rely on this kind of a system. It's not so great. Yeah. And so Miller also said there's a question about whether you're allowed to be mafresh from baked goods on raw goods, which is what's going on here. If I do it with tevel matzah, I'm taking a piece of tevel matzah, and that's the hafrashah on dough. And it's a question. In Shmir Shabbos, it says that there's no problem with that at all. Some of us are so convinced, but in Shmir Shabbos actually says it's okay. Both of this concern that I just mentioned is not a problem with tevel when you use it tevel dough instead of tevel matzah. Okay. Another thing is, there's another issue that comes back when you use a tevel system as opposed to just doing good old-fashioned hafrashah or even dough balls, is that it's being done shalom and hamukaf. Mukaf means to say is that the piece, the dough that you separate, the chal that you separate is supposed to be close to the item that's doing hafrashah on, and basically that's impossible. It's close to impossible in a factory. If you use tevel dough, it's truly impossible because tevel dough has to stay in the freezer. Well, there's no freezer in the middle of the baking area. But even if you use tevel matzah, it's going to be in a closed container, and the Gemara says that a closed container is never considered mukaf. Okay, there's no way to make it mukaf. And he says even if it would be in an open container, it would have to be right next to the baking bowl, which is not going to be. So if a person does hafrashas shloim in a mukaf, in the Yevet, the hafrashah works. But seemingly it's not l'chatchila. Seemingly we're telling the Mashiach every single day to do a hafrashah shloim in a mukaf because the Tevel is not next to the items that are being the hafrashahs on. So he's losing out on the fact that he's losing out. He's basically doing the wrong thing to do hafrashah shloim in a mukaf. Now, presumably the justification is that it saves people from eating tevel. It's saving them. But Lamai says it's not this most wonderful idea, which is to have a person continually doing hafrashah shloim in a mukaf. Okay. And the last thing within this idea of doing it remotely is that if the person, the mashgiach who's doing it, is doing hafrashah, he has to be the shliach of the person who asked him to do it. He has to be the shliach of the owner of the baked goods, and that's a problem when he. There's a problem if he's doing it. It makes it harder for him to be the shliach of the owner when he's doing it remotely. Well, the first time he can maybe get in contact with the owner, but with time, it makes it, there are different kind of complications about him being, whether he can actually be the shliach. And one way to avoid those problems is to say that the mashgiach should take ownership of the dough or ownership of the tevel matzah. And then once he takes ownership of that item, of the part that will be separated as challah, then he could say Zachal Amishloy B'fanav to do the hafrashah for him. He's doing him a favor to do hafrashah for him, and it's not costing that person anything because the mashgiach is using his own flour, his own dough, or his own matzah, and therefore that's a way to avoid this problem. I mean, there are potential problems. It's not so clear if you can do Zachal Adam if the tevel would belong to the owner of the factory, but you can, but if the mashgiach owns the dough, or owns the tevel dough, or owns the tevel matzah, it avoids that problems. It also solves problems of making him a shliach for davar shlo b'olam. If the dough doesn't show up yet, I make you a shliach today to be Hafrashas Challah for me. In 5 years from now, you're still doing it. That dough, the flour that it's made from, wasn't even planted. So it's a real davar shlo b'olam, and it also avoids questions of the mashgiach, the manager who's not Jewish, making you the shliach if you don't speak to the owner himself. So, but all of these are avoided if the mashgiach takes possession of the dough, or the tevel dough, or the tevel matzah. Okay, now, and our last group of issues with the tevel system has to do with the way you do the hafrashah. So, as I read beforehand, this whole long paragraph that the mashgiach has to say in order to make the hafrashas, and he has to say Belilah Raccah this way, and Belilah Raccah goes this way, and all the details of that. It's a whole to do. And so there's a question. In Tzvi Pesach Frank, he says it applies that he really has to read it. He can't just say I want the hafrashah to work. I want the hafrashah to work like whatever I'm supposed to say. Let it work as per the paragraph. The Chazon Ish is mashma that he is. It's good enough to just say I'm doing the hafrashah according to the nusach. Whatever the paper says, that's what I want to do. It could be there's a possible reading that maybe even Tzvi Pesach would be maskim. In our case, where there's a written version of the nusach, maybe he'd be masking to that. But that, again, this is a question whether you have to actually say the whole long nusach, or you can maybe get away with just saying, I want to wake up in the morning and say, hi, I want all the hafrashas to work like it says on the paper. Okay, now, most hashgachas tell their mashgichim that if they use this tevel system, they should make the bracha like you're supposed to. The good old-fashioned, the bracha the way it's supposed to be. So Rishon Miller asks on that there's a mashmois from Magen Avram, that when you do a mitzvah that's not going to happen live, I mean, I say now that when something happens, when the dough is made in the future, I want there to be a hafrashah. So what I'm saying now, nothing's happening. There's no mitzvah happening now. And when the mitzvah happens, I'm not doing anything. It's like they're sort of separated from each other. Then you don't make a bracha, not at the time when I do my thing, and not at the time when the mitzvah happens. And there's a lot of merit to it, from those point. And a way to allow the person to still make a bracha would be to say, as we said beforehand, instead of saying I want hafrashas to happen for the future, you would say I want hafrashas to happen for the past. If we did that, then there would be no problem with saying the bracha. Okay, now lastly is that when a person says I want to be mafresh, that today's hafrashah should be, the batter should be for the one that's right next to the one that was before, that was done yesterday. That's fine. That's considered. There's a mitzvah. You have to specify where the dough is that you're making hafrashah, and that this is good enough. Even though you're not being very specific, you're saying next to the one that's good enough. But Lamaisa, what we're missing out on is that the Ramah says he's supposed to be hafrashah kazayis when you do each hafrashah, and here no one's going to be hafrashah kazayis. Because if you keep hafrashah kazayis every day for every batter, you're going to very quickly run out of Tevel. So people mafresh, the way I read it before, it was a gram. Some people do even less than a gram, but they want it to last a long time. And think about it, a box of matzah holds 454 grams. So you only get 454 batters. That might not last very long in a bakery that does, 10, 20 batters a day. Not going to last very long. So some people do even less than a gram. Okay, and another thing is that the Ramah says that the challah needs to be burnt. That's the way to destroy it. Most people do not end up actually burning this tevel at the end of the year. Most people instead are Samech on Chazanish, who says that if you just destroy it, that's also good enough. But either way, yes, that should happen at the end of the year, or when the tevel is all used up. Let's say you have your like I said, the case of box of matzah, that's 454 grams. So eventually they've all been used up. All of them have been made into truma. At that point, you do need to destroy it and get rid of it and get yourself a new box.